I want to talk to you about the PILT program for a minute, payment in lieu of taxes. On the Department of Interior website, there's an explanation that the PILT program involves, quote, payments to local governments that help offset losses in property taxes due to non-taxable federal lands within their boundaries, close quote. And so based on this explanation, I assume you agree with that definition, with that description of the program. Based on that, you would identify this not as not a handout, it's not a special interest carve-out or something like that. This is a payment that we make to local governments in order to help make them whole, or at least in some way offset the burden of having non-taxable federal land within their jurisdiction. Is that right?
That's correct. I agree with that.
Okay. Now, the 2016 budget proposes a year-long extension of the PILT program, and then there's a statement in there to the effect that while we're doing this, we also need to look at a sustainable long-term funding solution, and that a sustainable long-term funding solution needs to be developed. Can you talk to us about sort of your policy priorities or how you frame this issue as you look to make this a sustainable program over the long haul, and tell me whether you would consider, you know, tying some federal resource to this, whether it's perhaps revenue from timber harvested on federal lands or selling excess federal land to make it sustainable or something like that. How do you do that?
Well, we thank you for the question and for highlighting the importance of PILT, and as Senator Wyden did with secure rural schools. We know this is really important. We know that many of these communities rely on this money for the public services that they provide to the rural residents, but also to the visitors to those communities. This budget, as I said in the front end, is a forward-looking budget. It assumes that we move beyond sequestration. It assumes that we make investments in the future of this country. And I think, as you've seen over the last year with continued economic growth in the country, when we invest in this country, we see a brighter future, and people appreciate that. Finding a long-term mandatory funding source for PILT is very important. Just as I believe in support for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has been talked about at this session. We have lots of revenues that are collected on federal waters, for example. The funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund was intended to come from offshore oil and gas revenues. We collect something like $14.7 billion, a lion's share of that from offshore oil and gas revenues. It is possible that that funding source could be dedicated to PILT and secure rural schools, as well as the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We believe it should be mandatory. We'd like to work with you on solutions to make PILT mandatory so it's not a worry every single year, or not subject to sequestration as we felt in 2013. That's
great. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your willingness to put a high priority on this. My personal view is that it's got to be a high priority, and while you've got a lot of priorities to manage, and that's a difficult thing, I do think that PILT funding and making sure that it's fully funded, that it's adequately funded, that we're making adequate PILT payments, certainly ought to be ought to be of a greater priority than, say, other priorities like acquiring more federal land. At a time when the federal government owns, you know, nearly 1/3 of the landmass in the United States, more than 2/3 of the land in my state, and where disproportionately the land owned by the federal government that is bringing about these economic burdens on states and local taxing jurisdictions, are disproportionately in the western United States, it makes it a high priority. On February 10th of this year, Utah Governor Gary Herbert issued an executive order to further facilitate the protection of the greater sage grouse. Now, as you know, the state of Utah has already developed conservation plan for the sage grouse, one that I think addresses a lot of the competing interests and certainly addresses the most significant threats to the population of this bird. Can you tell me whether the Fish and Wildlife Service has endorsed this plan, and what the department's doing to coordinate with the state of Utah? And can you also give me your commitment that you'll work with Governor Herbert in giving this a chance to succeed?
Certainly, I have been working with Governor Herbert. I'll continue working with him. I'm aware of his executive order, and I very much appreciate it. I saw him just a couple days ago at the National Governors Association and asked if he could remove the 2017 expiration date, because the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to look over the long term to make sure that that they can rely on the executive order in order to make their determination. And he said he wasn't aware of that and would certainly look into it. So I appreciate that's the kind of cooperation I have, not just with Governor Herbert, but with all the Western governors and the states, as we have been very much at the table multiple times a year to address what's unique to Utah, what's unique to Wyoming, what's unique to Colorado and Nevada and Oregon and Montana and the other states. So you certainly have my word. I'll stay at the table. I'm keeping my teams at the table. The BLM plans are being finalized right now. I think it will be in the spring that those final records of decision come out. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service will have all of that, the state's plans, the BLM plans, to take into account as they make their final listing determination. But they've been at the table all along. There's no surprises, no secrets. We are finally getting information shared with us from the states, which is very useful, including Utah, because they'll need all hands on deck to make the right decision. And we are very, very hopeful that the kinds of efforts made by Utah and other states will give them the confidence they need to not feel a listing is warranted.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate that. I have great respect for Governor Herbert and his efforts in this area.
I do too.
And I appreciate your willingness to work with him and give that a chance to succeed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.